formative session called Wetlands for Disaster Resilience, in which we will bring together the findings and the goals of 2 research and innovation horizon projects that are funded by the European Union. And although they seem or look apparently distant from each other in their focus, they are closely connected, and we will see why today. And today, also through this session, we would like to emphasize a critical need or necessity for collaboration and knowledge exchange between the different consortium members of this project, researchers and practitioners, towards building resilience. I would like to thank to the partner organizations and the colleagues from these 2 projects for being here and sharing your work. And thanks also to our colleagues from Wetlands International's Global Network and the members of Wetlands International Europe for joining. I would like to introduce myself very, very shortly. For those who don't know me, I am Yurena Lorenzo, the head of programs of Wetlands International Europe. And my main role in the organization is to lead the project development and implementation of Wetlands International Europe, but I'm also responsible for mobilizing our networks and nurturing the work and the relation with our members. And I would like to introduce to Michelle Zeng, who is our policy officer on disaster risk reduction, and she is the one who's been behind this event, organizing everything. And she will be controlling and taking a look at the chat box, yes. And she will be posting some relevant information to ensure a smooth session today. I would also like to briefly introduce you to Wetlands International Europe, the organization that both Michelle and I are part of. Wetlands International Europe is part of Wetlands International's network of approximately 19 offices around the globe. We in Europe, Wetlands International Europe, we operate as a members-based organization. We are legally an association that is run by a secretariat which is based in Brussels, but also in the Netherlands. We have 12 members, NGOs from 9 different countries that work together at different levels, so local, national, and European, to advocate for the recognition of the services and the solutions that wetlands provide to solving the interlinked crisis of biodiversity, climate, and water crisis. But we also are part of the realization of this aim, but by working in restoration projects on the ground and demonstrating these benefits. So I was mentioning 2 projects which are the main reason why we are here. And these projects are WaterLANDS and MYRIAD-EU. Those are the acronyms of the projects. The first one, I'm going to mention first MYRIAD-EU, whose project title, the long one, is Multi-Hazard and Systematic Framework for Enhancing Risk-Informed Management and Decision-Making in the European Union. And this project works towards the realization of new ways for disaster risk management, looking at multi-risk and multi-sector approaches to risk management. And it's also developing new tools and solutions to reduce and manage risks. In the case of WaterLANDS, whose project title, the long one, is Water-Based Solutions for Carbon Storage, People and Wilderness. Through this project, the different partners are trying to lay the foundations for the protection of wetlands across larger areas in Europe, restoring these ecosystems and identifying, for example, by identifying barriers for restoration and the provision of integrated solutions. Both projects count on pilot sites to develop and test the different solutions proposed. And they also count on strong stakeholder-led and co-creation approaches. And we will hear some examples of this during the presentation. So why bringing these two projects together? There are many reasons. One, for example, is that Wetlands International Europe is involved in both projects with a common denominator, wetlands. In MYRIAD, we work as a sectoral representative for natural ecosystem and forestry, and we provide expertise on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction approaches for the different pilots. And in the case of WaterLANDS, we are supporting the policy advocacy activities and also the dissemination activities for the restoration and sustainable use of wetlands. Another reason why we have brought these two projects together is that at Wetlands International, we have been working for decades already on community resilience through ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction around the globe, of course, advocating for the role that wetlands have or play as natural buffers against climate change and disaster risks. And another reason, there are many reasons, another reason is that in the face of escalating climate change impacts, wetlands restoration emerges as a central solution, not only for biodiversity conservation, but also as a robust strategy for disaster risk reduction. So I hope that today's session will allow us to know more about these two projects, about the communities of knowledge and the practitioners that are behind these two projects. But I hope that it will also foster a greater integration of multi-hazard and sector risk management approaches into climate change adaptation and ecosystem management. So my colleague Michelle already posted the agenda. You have all the information about the speakers and technicalities. So I'm going to quickly hand the floor to our first speaker. And that's Dr. Philip Ward, who is leading the project MYRIAD-EU, and he is going to provide us a bigger or greater insight into this project. So Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene. Let me just share the slides. So could I just check if you're now seeing the very purple slides?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. So first of all, to our colleagues at Wetlands International, many thanks for the invitation and for setting up this event, also for the introduction. I think it's a really nice opportunity to be able to discuss and share these projects. So in particular, of course, from our side, really looking forward to seeing what's going on and what's planned in WaterLANDS. And exploring some of the potential synergies that we can create. So I think later on in this session, there's a couple of our pilot leads who will be presenting more from the pilot perspective. Some of these solutions we're coming up with. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I just want to give a brief overview of the project. So Irene mentioned it. It's all about multi-hazard, multi-risk assessment. But let me also try to sketch a little bit about what we're talking about when we say this and why it's also important. So here are some events from the last 12 months. This is a flood which took place last May in Italy, in the Emilia-Romagna region. It actually took place during our General Assembly in Venice at the same time. So we were very aware of what was going on there. And of course, a tragic event. But what was interesting about this event is that it actually was the flooding resulted due to a succession of different intense rainfall events, which also occurred on preconditioned, very wet soil. And this also took place after a very long drought, which meant that the soil had less capacity to absorb water. So there we see already lots of different kinds of hazards taking place, which actually made the impacts of this flood worse. Another example, I think all of us will have seen the news last year and seen all of the wildfires taking place around large parts of Europe. And this is an example from a region of Greece where in September, these wildfires were followed by very large floods. And these two events were not actually related to each other in a physical sense. However, the fact that the people, the farmers in this case, were experiencing both of these events meant that they were already suffering and were really not able to take that second blow caused by the hazard. So here we see it's also about those interruptions beyond the hazard into the impacts. And then earlier on last year, there were the tragic earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, which caused a large number of fatalities, homeless people, recovery efforts, but then followed soon after in Turkey by, again, large floods. And this meant that actually the relief and recovery efforts were hampered because those operations were already stretched by the fact that they were already responding to the earthquake. So this shows that there's lots of ways in which hazards, different kinds of hazards and risks can interact. For example, triggering relationships where you have rainfall, which might trigger a flood or trigger a landslide. We have so-called amplification relationships where a drought or dry conditions may increase or amplify the chance of a wildfire. We have compound kind of events, for example, where we have one storm that causes river flooding and coastal flooding, which actually means that the impacts are larger than if they occur themselves. And consecutive events. So, for example, this earthquake, which was followed by a flood, which meant that then the impacts on society were greater than some of the individual parts. And what we actually want to do within MYRIAD is not just to examine these kinds of interrelationships, but really examine how can risk be better managed if we actually consider all of these interrelationships between hazards. But beyond that, we're also interested in looking at how measures, so disaster risk reduction measures or climate adaptation measures, which are taken to, let's say, reduce the risk on one hazard, may actually increase risk from other hazards, what we call asymmetries. So here we see a classic example, a house which has been elevated to make it less vulnerable to flooding. But it's in an earthquake area, which means that actually it's collapsed due to the earthquake, right? It's been more vulnerable to the earthquake. And so we're also looking in the project at how can we better account for these dynamic feedbacks between these different risk drivers, also in the disaster risk management sense. And especially interesting, I guess, for this meeting is what could be the role of various nature-based and ecosystem-based approaches in doing this as kind of integrative aspect. And then another some novelty, I guess, of the project is that we're also looking at interrelated effects across sectors. So not just looking at one sector, energy, tourism, agriculture, forestry, ecosystems, whatever they may be, but how they actually impact on each other and how are they interrelated. And I'm sure that this will also be touched upon in the presentations by the pilots. So how can we actually account for these trade-offs and synergies between these sectors, these regions, and these hazards? Okay, so that brings us then to the vision and the aim of MYRIAD. The vision is quite lofty, I guess. That we put it like this: to catalyze a paradigm shift required to move towards a multi-risk, multi-sector, systemic approach to risk assessment and management, which all sounds very nice, but the aim, I think, makes it more concrete, and that's that by the end of the project, which is now in just over 1.5 years' time, together with our stakeholders in the pilots, we will be able to develop forward-looking disaster risk management pathways that look at these trade-offs and synergies between sectors, hazards, and scales, both time scales and also spatial scales. This is just to give you an idea of the consortium. So there are 20 different institutions from science, practice, small and medium enterprises, and several NGOs representing the different sectors in the project. We released a policy brief in November last year, and I just want to show 5 slides which basically highlight some of the results related to the 5 main recommendations in that policy brief. First is that real-world applications of this multi-hazard disaster risk are vital. So what we noticed is there's many academic papers which talk about the need to look beyond silos and integrate across different hazards, different sectors, etc., and producing frameworks and theories about this, but there's not actually many studies that do it in practice. And so we designed these 5 different pilot studies, which is shown on screen. And for each of these, we work together with stakeholders to try to actually address a future sustainability challenge. For example, in the Canary Islands, how can these island regions with strong dependence on tourism become more resilient to multi-hazard risk? And then we look backwards from this challenge to try to make pathways towards addressing that challenge. And so we start by looking at which sectors are involved in this. In this case, for example, tourism, food and agriculture, energy. And what hazards and interrelationships do we need to consider if we want to develop those pathways? So it's very different to like a classic risk assessment where we may say, for example, what is the risk of flooding in a given region and how can we adapt to it, right? We try to work from the future a more bottom-up, backwards way. A second recommendation really was that the terminology matters. And we noticed that within this field of multi-hazard, multi-risk assessment, cascading risk, systemic risks, many different terms are used. So we try to actually bring some clarity into this by bringing together these different definitions, and also a wiki site where we actually display different methods, tools, which could be used to assess multi-hazard risk. This is a wiki, disasterriskgateway.net, and it's open to contributions from the whole community. So also, if there are people from WaterLANds who would like to contribute tools here, that's perfectly possible and encouraged. Thirdly, we recommend that multi-hazard data is really vital for evidence-based policy making. So we see that there's lots of different data sets developed in all kinds of EU projects on different kinds of hazards: flood data, drought data, earthquake data, etc. So we don't want to make more of this within this project, but the idea is to see how can we bring it together to actually look at these multi-hazard events. So without going into detail here, what I can say is that one of our PhD students on the project, Judith, has developed a database of past multi-hazard events at the global scale. So we can start to systematically analyze their impacts and also start to map out what are the hotspots of multi-hazard in it, both globally and in Europe. Fourthly, we're trying to look at synergies between disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, and really how can we harness these. We're trying to develop, or let's say upgrade, this dynamic adaptive pathways approach, which is often used in a single hazard, single sector setting. For example, to develop flood risk management strategies whereby we can say that one action, raising a dike, for example, may be desirable for a given time horizon, but at some other time horizon, you may need to implement a different measure. And that's what's shown in these kind of these nice looking metro map visuals. And you can also start looking at the trade-offs and synergies across different measures, but so far not used in this multi-risk setting. So actually within the project, we are trying to upgrade this approach and apply it in several of our pilots. And then finally, well, there's a lot more going on, but the final one, which I will present, is that we really recommend to promote this systemic and multi-risk thinking. And to try to do that, we developed a relatively simple framework, which gives 6 steps which could be taken for actually carrying out such a multi-hazard, multi-risk assessment. And each of those steps, we devised a guidance protocol, which is a list of measure actions, questions to be addressed to do just that. This is the last slide, but I just wanted to mention that we will be hosting a conference in June in Amsterdam this year on this topic of natural hazard and risk in a changing world, addressing compound and multi-hazard risks. There's also a session in that conference specifically on nature-based solutions. So I would invite, if you're interested, to look at the website. The call for abstracts, by the way, closes today. So if anybody still wants to submit an abstract, then you have about 11 hours to do so. And happy to take any questions, but also outside of this meeting, it would be great if people want to reach out, then please do so.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was a very insightful and an impressive project, because I think that this paradigm shift is really needed. I forgot to mention that we are really packed today, so probably, well, I don't know, we won't have time for questions, but that doesn't mean that you are not allowed to post them and put them in the chat box, because I think that we can come back to you and answer them if we don't have the time, but let's see. So our next, I'm going to jump directly into our next presentation, and it's going to be made by Dr. Shane McGuinness from the WaterLANDS Consortium. He's working at the University College Dublin and leading this project. So yes, the floor is now yours, Shane.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm going to share a full screen now.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see it.
Lovely. Okay, I'll go back to the first slide, and hopefully you can still see full screen. If not, just shout, because I can't see faces now. Lovely. Thank you very much for the time. It's great to meet everybody formally from the MYRIAD project and some of our existing friends in Wetlands International and other partners that are aligned. What I'll do today is give a brief overview of what WaterLands is, how long it's been running, what we've achieved thus far, and some of, importantly, the sites that we are conducting restoration on, and some of the other sites that we're learning lessons from or precedent from to improve the restoration at other sites. So Richard and Gustav will later on talk in more detail about some of those sites. So at a glance, like Irene, you said, WaterLands stands for Water-Based Solutions for Carbon Storage, People and Wilderness. Quite a large project. It's running for 5 years, 60 months in total. Very large budget as well, as you can see. And importantly, I suppose, it's quite a large number of partners across 14 different countries. I'll show a big screen of logos now in a moment, but there are quite a few involved, and it is quite a challenge to coordinate all of that. But the intention is that it is much greater than the sum of its parts. We're coordinated from UCD, University College Dublin, here in Ireland. Myself and Craig, who I hope is on the call now, we coordinate. Louise is our finance manager in the background, Pauline, the irreplaceable project manager, and Katrina Devery, who also leads our art task, which I can say a bit more about, but that would take hours to go through. Very interesting though. The ultimate goal is co-created solutions for wetlands, and in particular the upscaling of wetland restoration across the EU, across Europe, including the UK. The point being that wetland restoration can be achieved with 23 million euro, but it will really be a drop in the ocean, excuse the pun. And what we really need to do is ensure that the work that we do across a defined 5-year period significantly upscales where we go with this. Oftentimes the weakness of projects like this is that they are defined in time and budget and capacity and people, and that they rarely lead to transformational change, which is ultimately what we've been tasked to do. As a very brief intro to wetlands, I suppose, as hopefully many people in this call already understand, they provide vital ecosystem services, whether it's emissions reductions, water services, biodiversity support, or socioeconomic provisions, whether it be cultural, jobs, incomes, livelihoods, food provision as well, but also, as we've spoken about already, the reduction in risk and the mitigation of those impacts. We're spread across Europe, like I said, 15 knowledge sites in blue, the dark blue dots. They feed into restoration at 6 action sites, the letters A, B, C, D, E, F. And the ultimate goal is a scalable legacy, I suppose, from this. Importantly, the restoration objectives of this, and this is very important, we have an initial 10,500 hectares of wetland restoration by 2026, and that will be initiated by the end of this year, 24. We've already initiated it at the majority of our sites, so we're well on track. Importantly, though, the definition of restoration here is not simply the re-establishment of ecological condition and function, but it's also the establishment of supportive governance, policy and strategy, whether it be local, regional, national or supranational. Supporting healthy communities, ultimately part of that and should never be removed from it. And also the establishment, or at least the catalysis of long-term finance, because ultimately in this neoliberal capitalist world we occupy, it's not going to happen for free, nor at the utopian willingness of everybody involved. Ultimately, we need to work within that system and ensure that we can afford to do this work and that it makes economic sense. And ultimately, a lot of this feeds into much larger policy obligations, the nature restoration law being one of the most important. In fact, we just contributed to a science paper looking at the nature restoration law just about a month ago, which I suppose has assessed how realistic it is to expect these ambitions to be achieved given existing policy landscapes and the intricacies of that, and also the oftentimes conflicting or antagonistic policies already present, whether it be for agricultural expansion and intensification, whether it be for water provision or for social indicators as well. We're aiming towards genuine co-creation, and this is important because most projects will say it in the grant application, but will rarely actually achieve it. And even within this project, it is already an extreme challenge because timescales do not often allow them or lend themselves to bottom-up grassroots co-creation, selecting sites, designing programs, encouraging proper integration of results. But what we have tried to do with the design of this program is to ensure that we're not simply focusing on the ecology first and then the other elements as subordinate or supportive of that. We have 4 key pillars which are equal in importance and focus. The ecology, for sure, which is restoring services on the top left of the diagram there. Community, which is engaging communities, top right. Governance, which is aligning the governance and policy associated with this. And then also the finance, or mobilizing finance for this. What we aim to do is assess each one of those 4 main pillars and co-create best practice for effective restoration of wetlands and the upscaling of that. In other words, we're creating a new paradigm for wetland restoration. We're fostering the scalability beyond our network, whether that be expanding existing sites or replicating that at other similar sites, whether it be a peatland, a coastal wetland, an inland karst wetland, or something else entirely. And then in theory, actually in practice already, catalyzing blended finance around that. And by blended, I mean both traditional top-down state or EU-led funding, which the vast majority of restoration is supported by, and supplementing that, not simply co-funding, but properly actively match funding with commercial sources, whether it be on loan bases, whether it be on direct CSR, corporate social responsibility, or even philanthropic basis. What we're aiming for here is not a lacking ambition, is transformational change. Now, realistically, and we acknowledge this, achieving transformational change within 5 years, or the remaining 3 years of this project, would be naive to presume. What we are aiming for is a trajectory towards this transformational change, ensuring that we establish a system that perpetuates itself and that grows organically beyond the life of November 26. Like I said, 15 knowledge sites feeding into 6 action sites across 14 partner countries. And these are our partners. And importantly, they're across not just academia, which there are many of, but just as equally is represented government departments, semi-state bodies, non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, community groups, to ensure that any solution we propose is not simply seen as an ivory tower top-down academic solution, but has been embedded from the get-go, both in terms of funding and partner involvement, has been embedded in pragmatism on the ground. How do we realistically achieve this? Who are the people we need at each site or elsewhere to achieve what we want to? Just briefly, I'll go through our restoration sites. And again, Richard will go into one of these in detail, and then Gustav will focus on one of our knowledge sites. In Ireland, we're looking at an existing special area of conservation called the Culca Aniran SAC. And it's linking in with a much larger project called the Wild Atlantic Nature Project, which is a life IP. In this area, it is upland, it is farmed still at a low level, mainly sheep farming, but it's also extracted. So there is some both legal and illegal peat extraction or mining, quite damaging to the hydrology of the area, but also the ecology. What we're looking to do is incentivize farmers to change practices through what are known as results-based payment schemes. And that feeds into the Common Agricultural Policy and potentially might be scalable at an EU level. The next is in Northern England. It's associated with the Great North Bog in Yorkshire. And I'm not going to say too much on this. I'll let Richard go into this in much more detail. But basically what we're looking at is partnering with a much larger collective of peat partnerships across a vast area, largely looking at the provision of water in that area and the fantastic work that the University of Leeds have done with their Integrated Catchment Solutions Programme, or ICASP. The third one is the Netherlands. So much more hard engineering, straight edges, or at least hard edges anyway, and looking at the Ems-Dollard estuary. So very important economically in terms of shipping and navigation, but also very important in terms of the farmland nearby and the ecological services provided by that. Most of the land you see in this picture is well below sea level. And as you can imagine, the importance of those dikes that you see on the left are increasing every single day, as is the height of those dikes. So what we're looking at there is trying to soften those edges, ensuring that sea level rise can never be ceased, I suppose, aside from massive expense, but rather softening those dikes and creating wide green dikes, maybe even allowing inundation at certain times of the year. Our fourth site is in Estonia in a catchment called the Pärnu catchment. Several different interesting sites here, and this is where we partner with some of our local semi-state bodies. So one is a peat extraction company or peat mining company called Utsi Turvas in the middle. Another is the Estonian State Forestry Management Center, and then an environmental NGO there, as well as the University of Tartu. Importantly, this is a large landscape approach where we're looking at the various different stakeholders and existing use cases of this area. So the scalability of this is massive in terms of the estates or land banks associated with both the semi-state forestry, the existing peat extraction, and the transition of both of those industries towards something a lot more sustainable. Our fifth one is in Italy, the Venice Lagoon, and we're looking at the transformation of quite an important economic resource, I suppose, and to something softer that benefits people more than simply foreign tourists and cruise ships. Difficult to achieve, and there are lots of vested interests, and the scale of it is absolutely enormous, 550 kilometers squared. Now, we can't achieve that, but what we can do is start to move towards a paradigm shift at that location. And then the last one, this is my second last slide, is looking at the Dragoman Marsh in Bulgaria, which is an inland karst wetland. On the left, you can see what the wetland looks like, but on the right, you can see the land ownership of this area, which looks like an incredibly complicated chessboard. And this is one of the main challenges here, in that technically speaking, or literally it is a lake, but technically speaking, it is still farmland. It's owned by people in lots of different slivers. And that's one of the big challenges here, is a governance perspective, is trying to reframe this wetland, which actually isn't recognized as a wetland in Bulgaria under the Water Framework Directive. So part of this is to shift policy and governance and local perception towards understanding the value of what is already a wetland. In terms of linkages to MYRIAD, I can see lots, obviously, there are myriad linkages. In terms of peatlands, well, this is a satellite image of a recent fire in Ireland on a peatland, but also in terms of the flood risk reduction potential of peatlands. They hold a huge amount of water, massive sponges, especially at upper reaches of catchments. Coastal wetlands, well, it was referred to already by Philip in terms of flooding, especially around Venice and other low-lying areas. And also in terms of inland wetlands, around the costs of treatment of water, costs of compliance to the directives that we're all party to, and even food production. So there was a huge risk associated with that. And we're experiencing that from the interest in the financial sector, especially in terms of insurance and reinsurance, who get it, and it is now very firmly embedded in the rhetoric at board level and shareholder level. I think I'll stop there. Feel free to drop an email. Again, we can talk more at questions and answers afterwards, but I'll stop sharing and mute. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Shane, and thank you for this comprehensive presentation of Waterlands. And it's quite interesting to see how both projects are very ambitious in terms of impacts. I've heard about transformational change and paradigm shift, And I'm wondering, not that I'm asking now, because let's see if we have space at the end, how challenging this is in this multi-stakeholder, multi-hazard, and diverse geographical context. So fascinating. Now we are going to zoom into the territory, and it's time now to hear from the pilots and the cases within these projects. Let me just quickly check the agenda. So our next case comes from the MYRIAD project. It's about the Scandinavian pilot, and Dr. Anne-Sophie Dalloz from Cicero will tell us what's happening in this pilot within MYRIAD. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share my screen first.
Okay.
Just oops. Can you see my presentation in presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, thank you for organizing this event, because it's yeah, although you said that the two projects seem to be working on two different topics, I mean, there are so many connections between the two. I think that we can already see already. And the Scandinavian pilot is a good example of that, even if I don't know if I will have time to show all the potential for collaboration. So yes, with my colleague Linma, oh, just 1 second. It doesn't go to the next slide. Yes. So with my colleague Linma, who is an economist and who is on the call now, we are a Scandinavian team, and we are working on the pilot study for Scandinavia, where we focus on 3 main sectors, which are energy, food and agriculture, and ecosystem and forestry. And as Philippe said before, we are not working on only one hazard, but we are working on several hazards at the same time. And I must say that actually, although the Scandinavian team is Linma and me, this project is quite complex and very interesting. So we have had to ask a lot of help from different people at Cicero working on different sectors and different topics like perceptions or yeah, governance, or many topics that actually Shane mentioned before. So just to tell you a little bit where we come from in the Scandinavian pilot. So the first thing we have done is actually starting with a stakeholder workshop, and to better understand the context in Scandinavia, to understand more or less what we know and what we don't know, for example, about hazards. So pretty quickly we realized, taking the example of Norway, that many people know that Norway or Scandinavia is getting warmer or wetter, and that extreme events are increasing in strength or in frequency. But we also understood with the interaction with stakeholders, for example, that there are new hazards, single or multi-hazard, that are not analyzed or taken in account as much as other type of hazards. So, not, for example, droughts or heat wave are not necessarily taken in account as much as extreme precipitation or floods, which is important when you think that there are potentially some of these events coming in the future. And we also realize, looking at the IPCC, at the data we can get from the IPCC, that if we look at our region, Northern Europe here, like the observed changes in heavy precipitation, there are high confidence that there is an increase in extreme precipitation, and that it's due to it's related to human contribution to the observed change. So that's also why we know a lot about the increase in extreme precipitation in Northern Europe. But if we look, for example, at droughts, we have much less data, because here, if you see that for Northern Europe, this rectangle is or this form is shaded, it's not because there is no data, it's because we don't really know the sign of the change. Some models will say that you can have an increase in droughts, but some others will say that you can have a decrease in drought, or some models don't really show any results, or here in the observations, not necessarily in the models. So one of the things we understood talking two stakeholders, but also looking at our data, is that first there is a need to provide better data for Scandinavia, but also for Norway. So one of the studies we have in preparation now is providing better insights on changes in heat wave and droughts for the future in Norway, nationally and regionally. And I don't have time to say more about that, but contact us if you want to know more about that. The other part, as Philippe said clearly at the beginning, we are not aiming necessarily at working only on single hazard. We are also working on multi-hazard. And what's interesting also in Scandinavia is that we have already experienced some of this multi-hazard. Like in last August, we had the extreme weather Hans that had huge impacts on Norway in terms of floods also, and in the southern part of Norway. And following Hans, we also had, again, precipitation, not necessarily as high, but because the infrastructure was already damaged a lot, it was difficult for the regions, for example, to prepare and to answer to this issue again. I think what's also interesting is that, again, I said before that we have had more preparation for extreme precipitation and floods. But what we've seen also in Scandinavia recently is this increase in drought or heat wave, and also compound hot and dry events. So, for example, in 2018, and if we thought that that wouldn't come again, last summer in northern Norway, we had again compound hot and dry events. So what's also coming out of our work in the Scandinavian pilot is that although, I mean, it's important to look at extreme precipitation and it's important to look at heat wave and droughts, it's actually important to look at water availability in general. And I think that's where we have an important connection, an interesting connection with wetlands, for example, because I think this is one of the solutions, nature-based solution that can help adapt to this excess and lack of precipitation, for example. So as Philippe also said before, we in MYRIAD-EU, we are working on different sectors, also not only on one sector. So in Scandinavia, as I said before, we work on agriculture, forestry, and energy. And why is it important to think about water availability in this context? It's, for example, because a lot of the electricity is generated through hydropower energy in Scandinavia. If we take Norway as an example, 90% of the electricity is generated by hydropower energy. So water is extremely important. And again, taking the example of Norway, in the agricultural sector doesn't really have irrigation systems in Norway. So in 2018, when we had the heat wave and drought, the hot and dry compound events, the sector was not ready for that. And one last thing in terms of sector, forestry is a very important sector for all Scandinavia. So water availability is also important in this context. What we are also doing in these projects is trying not only to look at individual sectors, but looking at the connections, better understanding how these sectors interact between each other, how they have trade-offs and synergies. And so we are also working on another paper led by Gwen Ducrot, and which is presented here, where we are trying to understand the economic cost of the compound event of 2018, and really trying to understand how these different sectors that I mentioned before interact between each other, to better understand how they can prepare, how we can work on disaster risk management in this context. So now the one more thing we are trying to do is developing these pathways that were mentioned before, the dynamic adaptive policy pathways in the context of multi-sector and multi-risk. And one of the things that we are trying to implement or to include in our pathways is actually social impacts that I think were mentioned before by Shane in some way. And we are also trying to include nature much more, because you can imagine that wetlands in our case is really an important solution that we need to include. And also because part of the wetlands in Scandinavia are also destroyed sometimes by agriculture and forestry. So I think we have also this interaction between sectors on both sides, like nature-based solution. Wetlands are part of the solution, but we also need to find a way to protect them better. And I'll stop here. I have a lot of comments on the previous presentation, but I guess, maybe we'll have time for discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm sensing that maybe we should need a follow-up something, but let's see. I'm still have some hopes that maybe we will have some time for a couple of questions and answers. Thank you, Anne. The next presentation is also, we are not moving from MYRIAD-EU, we're still in MYRIAD, and the next presentation will introduce us about another pilot, in this case, the North Sea pilot. And I would like to ask Sharon Tatman from Deltares to explain us a little bit what's going on in this pilot.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to join this information session. I'm going to take you now into the marine domain. So I'm going to give you some information background about the North Sea pilot as one of the 5 pilots of MYRIAD. I'm hoping that you can see my full screen now.
Not yet. Maybe you need to try with presentation.
Okay.
Slideshow, click there. Then I suppose we will be able to see it.
Yeah, I have it on my screen. I am going to try something else. I will stop sharing and I'm going to switch screens. I'm hoping that that's going to help. Just a moment. Sorry about this.
No problem.
Sharon, I think you can also try, up on your screen, let's switch to not presentation mode or slideshow or something like that. Like in Teams, I think it's up. But try first the other.
I've changed it. I've now moved it to another. I've got too many screens open here in front of me. I've now got a third screen. Let me see.
There you go.
I'm going to remember this. Okay, if I use my left-hand screen, it works. If I use my right-hand screen, it doesn't work.
It doesn't.
Okay, apologies for that. Very quickly, I'm going to take you through the North Sea pilot. This is a pilot that is being led by Deltares together with the British Geological Survey. And I have also included 1 or 2 slides from Anne-Sophie, who has also been involved in our pilot recently. So it's really a joint effort within the MYRIAD project. I'm going to first of all very quickly take you through some of the events that have been happening in the North Sea and also quite recently, and then I will show you a bit of background on one of the methodologies that we are trying to develop to how to deal with these multi-risks and with our stakeholder community. And for whatever reason, ever since the beginning of the MYRIAD project, it seems that these hazardous events are increasing in the North Sea. I don't know if there's a relation between these two things, but it was very difficult at the beginning to convince the stakeholder community that this, taking on board these multi-hazards and risks and the sectoral interaction is really important. At the time, there was less awareness of this, and now suddenly things seem to be happening in the North Sea, which I've got 2 examples here on this slide. I think it was about a year and a half ago, we had a severe storm where a cargo ship, Julietta D, lost its engine power and drifted into an offshore wind farm, which is under construction, and collided with another tanker and with a turbine and a transformer station. At the time, there was no loss of life, thankfully, and there was only superficial damage to the wind farm. But if that has happened to a wind farm that was actually in action, it could have meant a huge power outage for at least the Netherlands. So this goes to show that with a natural hazardous event, an extreme event, it could have had a big knock-on effect to the country. Another example was also related to a storm, was the MSC Zoe, which lost a huge number of containers and spilled a large amount of debris, but specifically microplastics into the Wetlands area, which is an Natura 2000 wetlands area, causing a lot of detrimental effects to the ecology in that area. These are two examples of storms, but what we're seeing now in the North Sea is that there are more events like this. There are heat waves, greater algal blooms, so different events that seem to be happening more often and more extreme. And at the same time, the North Sea is one of the busiest shipping routes, a huge density of activities, and a lot of cross-sectoral risks seem to be occurring now, and will increase with the climate change impacts that we're expecting. And then at the same time, we're going to be building a huge number of wind farms in the North Sea. And these are just some of the planned wind farms. And in the graph on the right, you can see how each country is accelerating their wind farm area. So there's going to be a clash between the spatial use of the North Sea and these climate change hazardous events. And what makes this so relevant is that what we can see is that where we're building wind farms, we also have huge traffic through shipping. Both of these sectors are going to increase in their use of the North Sea. And climate change is going to make any events that happen worse. And as you can see from this picture, a lot of these, where all of this is clashing, is very much in the coastal zones. And this is where, and these are also the most ecologically valuable and important zones. So it's basically where everything is coming together. So if we just look at the what this means, what the climate scenarios are telling us, just for the Netherlands. So just to take the Netherlands as an example, what we're expecting is that there will be changes happening in the North Sea. And then we're related to how this could impact the ecosystem and nature is that we're already seeing heat events, so increase in extreme temperatures, more sunshine, stronger wind gusts, heavier showers. And then incidentally, we're expecting less change in wind speed and direction. And that's important for us to know for what we're expecting in terms of these storms. But a lot of this is uncertain. And then on top of that, the North Sea is really not in a very good state, as the recent OSPAR quality status report noted, especially about the North Sea, is that it is very much under pressure from all this use and is already affected. The ecosystem and biodiversity is already affected. So what we're doing to the North Sea is what you can see here in this rows on the left-hand side. The events, these hazardous events, are increasing. And by building so much into the North Sea, we're making ourselves much more vulnerable to these disaster risks. So this is basically what the case is about. And what we're looking into is how can the spatial planning of the North Sea at this interface between land and sea be optimized in the face of increasing and interrelated risks from climate change. And in the project, we're bringing together several different sectors and sort of working together collaboratively with stakeholders to understand how the system is working now and into the future, and finding relationships between these hazards and the impacts to these sectors. And together with the sectors, we want to try and come up with ways forward in these pathways into the future. So we're using a storyline methodology to do this joint spatial planning and multi-risk decision making. And storylines are a qualitative description of the chains of events that have happened in the past and plausible future events. By doing this together collaboratively with our stakeholders, what we're trying to get out of them is to hear from them what their practice is and to find out sectoral interdependencies in their decision-making processes. And storylines is just a tool to understand what's going on. and then, as I said, to make these future pathways so that we can come up with these disaster risk management strategies for the future. It's a stepwise approach. I won't go into the methodology, but what we try to do is, together with stakeholders, understand the system, find out what the hazards are they're facing, how their sector deals with it, and what their, well, basically short-term measures can be. We've been doing this together with Wetlands International. Michelle joined us in our last focus group, and we have the nature sector on board, government sector, the offshore wind sector, and shipping. And then in these, we've had a few workshops, and basically in the previous workshop, we wanted to develop these storylines. And just to give you an example, these are some of the guiding questions that we ask the stakeholders present. We haven't finished this part of the project yet. We are now into, we've developed past storylines, and we're building and visualizing a future storyline for storm events. And what we are planning on doing now is making the inventory of from each sector what the measures are to mitigate certain impacts. And what's interesting is in the workshop already, we could see the discussions happening between the different sectors on how measures that one sector takes interacts with another one. And we got a lot of information through Michelle, which I've just noted down here. I won't read all of this, but we've gone through the different hazards, the goals for the nature sector for the North Sea, which is this 30-30 ambition, 30% of the North Sea restored and protected by 2030. And to get there, there's a number of mitigation and planning measures that can be taken. And just to give an example, the wind sector gave as their ambition that they want to be net positive in their developments of offshore wind for nature by 2050. So this is a nice example to see how Wetlands International can interact together with the wind sector to hopefully try and achieve this, but then also in view of the disaster risk reduction measures that have to be taken. So we're now in the process of visualizing our storylines. We haven't finalized those yet. And then my final slide, what have we learned so far in our pilot? Well, I've already explained that we are now seeing more and more extreme events, and they're having an impact on the sectors, but also on the ecosystem. The stakeholder engagement is quite challenging for a pilot and a region where many of the stakeholders are not that yet aware of these events and what it means for them. Unlike the Scandinavian pilot and some of the other pilots, there really is almost no data available on multi-hazard events and the multi-sectoral impacts, which is why we chose the storyline approach, because we can do that with less data. And it's still work in progress. So we have 1 or 2 more workshops coming up. So if anybody's interested in this, I would invite you to contact me and maybe invite you to one of our upcoming workshops. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was quite inspiring, and also, I mean, I think that we have a lot of homework to do, because one of the things that you mentioned that got my attention, it's about this clash between the use of in this case, the North Sea, but I'm thinking the use of the land, the use of the sea, and these climate hazard events. And when you mentioned that the more we carry out uninformed planning decisions, the more vulnerable we become. So we need this joint spatial planning, informed one, and multi-decision making, which is quite challenging. And I'm thinking how this could, or by or using the results of this project, how this could also better inform the elaboration or the realization of the natural, the nature restoration plans that are to come. So a lot of things go through my head, but let's see. I mean, I'm a bit sad that I don't think that we will have the time to talk a lot, but I'm taking notes. So these are things that we can maybe follow up and have a discussion about it.
Yeah.
So let's move now to another place, and that place is called WaterLANds. So we're going to move again to the project WaterLand, and we will have 2 presentations about 2 different project sites. And the next one is the project site in the UK, and Dr. Richard Grayson from the University of Leeds will explain us what you are planning or what you are working on in this project site.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Hopefully you could see my screen now. Yeah, take that as a
yes.
Great. So yes, I for once don't need to introduce Waterlands because Shane's already done that for us. So thank you very much for that. So yes, here in the UK, my name's Richard Grayson from the University of Leeds. I coordinate our activity in the UK, but we kind of are a broader team. So there are many other people involved in the project that are not named on that screen there, but we work as a team, covering various different bits from the physical science through to social sciences, economics, finance, etc. So, as Shane mentioned previously, we've had a programme at Leeds called ICAS, which is Integrated Catchment Solution Programme, and that's been running for what 7 years now? No, 5 years, I think it is. And that's really a project that's been funded by UKRI initially to try and sort of work with partner organisations to deliver catchment solutions. So we're kind of using that model of working broadly with a broad range of partners across the whole of the north of England, really, to deliver this waterlands activity. And we've scaled that up a little bit from Yorkshire to the whole of the north of England through this Great North Bog, which I'll explain a little bit more about as we go along. So in terms of some context setting, well, peatlands in the UK, so we're sitting here, got approximately 1.42 million hectares of peatland in the UK, well, in England. Total in the UK is close to 3 million. Kind of slightly obsessed about deep versus shallow peat a lot of the time, somewhat arbitrary at times, but we kind of have this large area of deep peat and a lot of also shallow peat sitting across this. And unsurprisingly enough, they provide a broad range of ecosystem services, which we'll sort of focus on a few of these today, a little bit more detail as we go along. But sadly, only really 13% of that deep peat area is in natural conditions, so much of it is heavily degraded and has been for quite some time now. So we have quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from those. The numbers are quite high for peatlands in general, but that does also include lowland peatlands, which are farmed as well. So the numbers are quite high that's associated with that. So less so on the uplands that we're working with. And I suppose one thing that we really, as a starting point, we still don't really know how much peat we have within England, at least anyway. So we kind of have a rough idea, but ultimately the numbers aren't precise. So there's a programme at the moment that's been funded by UK government to create this England peat map, and that's trying to pull lots of different data sets together and use new approaches to try and get a better handle on what it actually is we have there to try and work with. So what does it look like? Well, we have, the area that we're working with across the north of England within waterland is generally this sloping bank bog landscape that we see. So fairly gentle slopes, deep areas of peatland, so several metres in many locations, and then sort of shallowing out as we hit the slightly steeper slopes there. As I mentioned previously, this landscape has been heavily degraded through time. Number of different reasons for that. Historical air pollution has been one of the key issues that's driving it. Overgrazing, so we have lots of sheep on the landscape, or I've had lots of sheep in the landscape previously. The numbers have decreased through time, but still the legacy persists there. Government initiatives around drainage, so there was a government push in sort of 70s, 80s to try and expand the area of agricultural land. So these uplands were drained, so people were paid to cut drains into that landscape. Also conifer plantation, so forestry is an issue across large parts of the north of England, particularly in Northumberland. So they've got extensive areas of forested peatland up there. And then we also have this planned patch burning, which is associated with grouse shooting, which is a key issue that sort of rears its head a lot of the time within our upland systems and the way they manage the landscape there. And we also have wildfires as well, but typically these aren't really wild. There's some form of ignition by a human of some description in that process there. We also got other issues that's kind of coming to the fore a little bit at the moment. So there was a moratorium on sort of inland wind farms, but that's now sort of pushed away now. So there is a interest in having more wind farms in on the peatland systems, and there's currently a planning proposal going in at a site quite near us for hundreds of turbines on the top of a peatland system. Anyway, so impacts there's quite varied: gulling, lots of erosion taking place. Seen an increase in floods, increase in CO2 being released. These landscapes use a lot for water supply as well, so we've seen a lot of aquatic carbon increases because it's actually measured there, so we can say that. And general aquatic ecosystem damage as well. So there's been a lot of effort to restore this landscape through time. Slightly more piecemeal than it currently is, but we common sight during the winter months, helicopters and excavators out on site doing lots of physical restoration works. Schemes are large, millions of pounds sort of schemes. These are being run. So we've seen lots of ditch blocking, gully blocking, bare peat restoration through time. So some of that's been really successful. So we can see here an example from the Peak District where we've seen a lot of change in terms of vegetation recovery through that restoration process. But I suppose now is the kind of time to really try and upscale that restoration. So taking it from a kind of sort of more piecemeal approach to an upscaled approach now, which is kind of fits with what we're trying to achieve through Waterlands. So we've been set targets by the UK government now in terms of restoration. So there's targets by 2050 to restore large areas there to achieve net zero emissions. And that has been one of the key drivers, and it kind of keep coming that actually carbon is one of the key drivers for a lot of this. So the government has funded £50 million to restore a set area by 2025 through a programme, but now we are moving towards looking for increased private finance to achieve this. Because if you see there's actually, we've got £50 million from the government, but actually there's, the cost of restoring is, possibly up to £21 billion to restore all of the UK peatlands. So there's a kind of significant shortfall in funding there. So we're then looking towards private finance to try and fill some of those benefits. But according to those that know best, the benefits versus the costs are quite good in that respect. So in theory, if we can sell it, it should be a good proposition there. So in terms of what we're doing, we're working with the Great North Bog in the north of England. And this is a consortium of 6 different delivery partnerships that have been working across the north of England to deliver peatland restoration. And in this area, we're talking, this is sort of like 6,670 square kilometres of upland peat, so it's a really big area, and what they're trying to achieve is a sort of roughly 10,000 hectares of restoration per year. Within the organisations, there's lots of good experience within those. Some of them have been going on for sort of decades, but others less. So it's kind of trying to bring everybody together to work together as this Great North Bog. So I suppose today, a lot of the restoration activity has been around biodiversity. Some of it's been linked to water quality as well, but it's really trying to think about what else we can achieve through that. So can we optimize these kind of systems of this restoration for multiple benefits, really? So we're talking about carbon storage, flood risk mitigation, and drought. I mean, I put it in brackets there, but it's becoming more to the fore as the drought side of it. Also want clean water, so biodiversity, land management, to be able to carry on other activities that are taking place, protect the historic environment, and also around health and well-being as well there. So we've seen some sort of positive benefits from some of the restoration so far, but what we've really found is that actually, in terms of the short-term recovery of these landscapes after restoration, particularly from a hydrological perspective, it does take quite a long time to see those benefits. And what we're really trying to figure out now is whether there's ways of going in and sort of maximising those outcomes. in a kind of a better time period, really. So while we say, well, there it goes, while we wait to get some of the functions to recover, can we sort of spatially design these approaches to offer these multiple benefits around flood and drought risk, greenhouse gas? And there's quite a bit of work now looking at the flood risk side of this, and I will say that, you know, a lot of the designs in terms of what's gone on the restoration for the ditch and gully blocking hasn't been focusing on flood, so the design isn't necessarily there. So it's like, how do we maybe modify the design and the approach for that to do that? So yeah, really all about taking a slightly different, nuanced approach and trying to get those multiple benefits across the landscape. So yeah, from a flooding perspective, we've demonstrated, well, there's a work package within WaterLANDS where we looked at various different ecosystem responses. And this is looking at water table depth versus flooding. And, you know, you'd think that having a high water table wouldn't be good, but actually having a high water table is better from a flooding perspective. So we see less flooding, less flashy systems potentially as well there. So how can we sort of really achieve that through time? Wildfire, yeah, so this is really coming to the fore at the moment. So we have wildfire that's driven by, well, human activity, be that barbecues, be that fireworks in the landscape, deliberate ignitions as well. So some of these sites are going up, having wildfires sort of 5, 6, 7 times during spring, potentially because of the high population densities around them. So it's really becoming a big thing. So there's a campaign called Be More Aware at the moment, and that's being led by some of the organisation partners involved in it and the local fire services to really try and press home to people that what they're doing is a real risk in that landscape. So can we design the restoration as well to try and mitigate some of that, right, by keeping that landscape wetter as well? As I said, lots of these landscape is used for water supply. We've seen increase in carbon concentrations in the water, predicted to increase further. So can we start to design those features to sort of reduce that potential? Particularly some ideas around creating pools in the landscape and how they might be able to benefit from that water quality potential there. But despite the fact we've worked together for quite a number of years, there's these partnerships working together, there are still lots of barriers in this. But really it's about, you know, how do we secure the finance? It's still unclear. There's still a lot of work in progress, and we're having currently recruiting for a role to support the Great North Bog in that, in their approach to green finance to fund the restoration there. There's issues around the market not working well at the moment in terms of landowners holding back while the price of carbon increases potentially, so they don't want to move until they've got a good price on their carbon, so that delays projects from happening. How do we upscale in terms of all the facilities, the contractors, the amount of equipment we've got and everything? So there's big questions around that when we want to work at scale. And then, yeah, it's working with existing activity in the landscape. We've got these grouse moors where they regularly burn their landscape, and how do we change that behavioural mindset when that's what they want to do? And that becomes a sort of a tension. So a lot of the community engagement work that we're trying to do there is around that kind of aspect of it. So trying to get people to work more closely together and, you know, be a bit more sort of joined up within that. And then also there's lots of sort of issues around the science inputs. You know, how do we optimize the restoration? How do we maybe change it, make it more cost effective as well going forward? I've probably run over time there, haven't I? So I probably should stop.
Thank you very much, Richard. Let's move to our last but not less important presentation. It's also a project site from WaterLANDS, and it's going to be presented by Dr. Gustav Granath from the Uppsala University, and the project site is in Sweden.
All right, hello everyone. I realized that it was a while since I used Teams, so I need to figure out how to share. Interesting.
There is a button on top next to the leave button, which is in red. You see, share?
this the one I can share? Okay, I can share the desktop. I guess that's good enough.
Yes, you choose, yes.
It's okay. All right. What do you see, guys? Do you see yourself now?
No, not yet. Well, no. You still have to share. So when you click on the share button, you will see different options, and it can be your desktop.
I don't, because I'm just using, I'm in the browser just.
Okay.
Christoph, I also have your presentation, so if you like, I can also share my screen.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, so that would be good, instead of trying to figure this out.
You could just let me know if you would like me to go on to the next slide.
Yeah, you can move on. I don't have any fancy animations or anything, so that's fine. All right. Wait a sec. Why I can, sorry, now I don't see what happened here. This is annoying. What happened to my all right, okay, this is fine. All right, sorry about that. I'm Gustav, and I'll give you a brief introduction into rewetting in Sweden, a little bit about the rationale, the strategies, and the ongoing research. Not going to be too much about the specific sites. As a proper academic, it seems like I ignored the instructions, so I also missed putting the WaterLANDS logo here, I realized, so sorry about that. But I'm in the WaterLANDS project, so we can move on to the next slide. So I'm a researcher at Uppsala University. Started out as a plant ecologist, moving more into ecosystem ecology, where I'm studying the impact of global change on ecosystem processes, both in peatlands and in forests. So this range of ecosystem functioning I'm looking at, from plant communities, greenhouse gases, water quality, etc. I also have a research program on peat mosses, so I have a specific interest in that, where I'm looking at their traits and their functioning in peatlands, but also a bit of their genetics. All right, you can move on. In Sweden, peatland rewetting kind of started, I would say, 2010. Before that, it had mostly been limited to maybe post-harvesting efforts and things like that. Of course, we had the constructed wetlands in farm land, etc. But for rewetting of peatlands, this is sort of like the early years, I would say, which was initiated by a large EU project, the MYRIAD. Here, the focus was more or less only on biodiversity. A lot of the focus was on birds. And we're looking at, actually, this is the site that is mentioned within the WaterLANDS project. Here you see a before and after picture of this previously peat harvesting site, where they cleared the forest and then rewetted, blocked the ditches for rewetting them. Okay, can move on. Nowadays, the focus is much more on the ecosystem services, creating multifunctional wetlands, where focus is on climate, reducing, increasing carbon uptake, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then we also have the nutrients, increased nutrient retention in the landscape, and then reducing, like we heard in previous presentation, reduce peak flows, increasing water storage in the landscape. Of course, biodiversity is still there, but it's not in focus as it was before. Of course, this will require increasing capacity and competence in society, and also understanding how to integrate these functions across catchments, including different wetland types. And it also then becomes evident that we need to solve the funding issue. I can move on. Okay, so this is a quite complicated graph, just showing a little bit how it works in Sweden. Well, you can look at the bottom where you see landowners, NGOs, and municipalities, etc. So this is actually where things are happening, sort of like the operational unit in the re-wetting or some of the restoration. In Sweden, it's much, the strategy is much that these kind of landowners, NGOs, etc., apply for money within different programs. The programs are a bit above. Some of them are circled in yellow. You can see LBP, LONA, peatland re-wetting, for example. So those are different programs. Government is then allocating money to these programs, and that can vary between years and governments, etc. And the money is funneled through the different authorities that you see more further above. There are also some restoration re-wetting being performed by the local authorities. That's the county administrative boards. That is all focused on protected areas, though. Can also be focused on aiding the sort of like facilitating maybe conservation of specific target species as well. Some of the money is also coming directly from the European Union to the county administrative boards to perform these re-wettings or restorations, and that's usually within specific program like the Life Admire program. Can move on. So what are we re-wetting in Sweden then? Well, if we stick with the peatlands here, we have, for example, old peatland excavation sites. They may have been abandoned for 50 or 100 years ago. We have a lot of forestry drained, peatlands drained for forestry or drained for farming. Then we also have the overgrown drain ridge fence, which are more like a potential hotspot for biodiversity. So here again, I'm leaving out some of the other types of wetlands that we also have, of course, like in the more like, yeah, we have all the created wetlands in the that you can find in farmlands, etc. You can move on. So when it comes to these ecosystem services that are now in focus, we have, for example, the reducing greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands, drained peatlands. You're probably aware that we do have quite a lot of peatlands in Sweden. A substantial amount has also been drained for forestry or for farmland. Some of that drained farmland is then planted, abandoned and planted, and is now belongs like a forest instead, and a nutrient-rich one in those cases. And there's a specific one program in Sweden, I would say, that is focusing on this. This is the re-wetting program within the Swedish Forest Agency. They are now prioritizing nutrient-rich peatlands in the south, which research has shown are sort of like the large emitters of greenhouse gases. The drained peatlands further north in Sweden do not seem to have such large emissions, or not sort of like larger than natural peatlands actually in some cases. And when I say South Sweden, we're usually talking about the boreal emerald zone in southern Sweden, where we find a little bit more nutrient-rich areas and some of these previously abandoned farmlands as well that are forests now. And to the left here, you see a picture actually where quite typical re-wetting of a drained forest, where the forest is usually removed and then the ditches are blocked. Can move on. Nutrient retention, another ecosystem service that is highlighted in multiple programs, I would say. That's one of the goals, to improve that in the landscape. In research, we though see that re-wetting usually gives an early pulse of both DOC and nutrients, and we don't have very strong evidence that this improved water quality is happening. But this is ongoing research in Sweden, and we don't have long time series either, right? And you expect these effects maybe to kicking after quite many years. And of course, here the location in the landscape is very important, depending if the peatland is a headwater, for example, or located further down in the catchment. Move on. And the last one that is highlighted also in many different programs, that's the water retention and reduced flood risk, where the idea is that we heard before that one hopes to mitigate droughts in the landscape, but also improve the potential storage and lower the risk, flood risk in events of high precipitation. If we look at Sweden again, we see quite good evidence that storage increases, but we don't seem have been able actually to test much of these ideas around drought mitigation or reduced flood risk. So we don't have actually much evidence for that this is happening, and it's also empirical evidence, I would say, but also an area of research. And again, location of the peatland probably has a strong impact on the effect here, if it's a headwater or not, or in the size of the peatland as well. Continue. And just to sum up, that we have multiple ongoing rewetting programs in Sweden with slightly different focus, but ecosystem services, I would say, always is highlighted. And this is the focus is then on greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient retention, and water storage and flood risk. There is currently quite limited evidence that these promised effects will be fulfilled, but we have several ongoing research projects looking at this at the moment. Unfortunately, we have quite few experimental sites in Sweden, so we need to work a lot with natural variation and that kind of setting instead. And I just want to highlight two different research projects here. It's the PredPeat, which I'm the main PIO, and then we have, for example, the ReWet4, which we collaborate with a bit. They are located at SLU. That's all for me. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much for your presentation. We have 4 minutes left, and I was thinking about something. So I'm going to forget about my closing remarks and all that, because I think that my colleague Michelle, when she's going to send you the minutes of the session and all that, we can have them in there for you. And I was thinking that maybe I can ask a question to you, Philip, and to you, Shane, as you are the representatives of these two projects. And it's a very simple question, which is basically, after listening to all these presentations and listening to the different pilots, so what kind of key opportunities and challenges you see in enabling collaboration and exchange between the consortium partners, so between the two projects? Basically, it's a reflection about what you've heard today, and then I will conclude then after that, very briefly, because I feel bad. I have to ask something.
Yeah, I can come in very briefly and just maybe elaborate on something that I mentioned at the time, which is the upscaled potential of all of our particular restoration sites is reliant on finance, and an increasing amount of this financial availability is based on the risk associated with not acting toward this restoration, whether that's flood, fire, food, something else. And I think there's a really important linkage here, certainly within our two overlapped sites, but also more broadly in terms of understanding how to articulate that risk to people interested in helping. And even just, Philip, your simple schematic about the 4 or 5 different categories of risk and how they combine is really interesting, and I'd be keen to use that, or certainly work together on that for sure.
Yeah, great, and we would be very happy to share that and also talk about it at more length. I think I have 1 minute, so I see lots of opportunities. Let's carry on afterwards, I think. But you know, clearly there's a couple of those pilot or case study sites which overlap. So I think definitely there's potential to see where we can strengthen each other with some of those solutions there. I also put it in the chat. I found some of this really interesting on the dynamics of some of the measures, right, and how that plays out through time, not just being like you do something and then you reap the benefits, right? it's not like that, and it's something that we're also we're trying to work on within Myriad. And then also I heard some concrete invites from Sharon, maybe others, for inviting each other to, for example, stakeholder events, other events, and so forth. So those are things which immediately spring to mind.
Super.
I think I also need to give it
Fantastic.
some